Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. At this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Imani Barbarin. Imani Barbarin is a disability rights and inclusion activist and speaker who uses her voice and social media platforms to create conversations engaging the disability community. Born with cerebral palsy, Imani often writes and uses her platform to speak from the perspective of a disabled Black woman. In the last few years, she has created over a dozen trending hashtags that allow disabled folk the opportunity to have their perspectives heard, while forcing the world to take notice. Hashtag, patients are not faking. Hashtag, things disabled people know. Hashtag, ableds are weird, and others. Each provide a window into disabled life while forming community. Imani is from Philadelphia area and holds a master's in global communications from the American University of Paris. Her published works include those in Forbes, Rewire, Healthline, Bitch Media, and more. She runs the blog crutchesandspice.com and a podcast of the same name. Welcome, Imani Barbarin.
Hello, okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. I'm just waiting for my laptop for a second so I can make sure that we're looking all at the right slides. I'm so glad to be here today and so glad that I have ADHD medication. All my brain cells are clicking in the right places and they're inside seating. So thank you. So I appreciate it. All right, so today we're going to be talking about not just disability and conflict, but also disability intersectionality. I come from the perspective that disability is the common denominator for all oppression, right? When I think about disability, I think that every single thing, every single bias, every single idea around disability manifests itself in so many other different cultures, in the way that other cultures are treated, the way that other gender expressions experience bias and, excuse me, sorry, I'm just bringing it up real quick, understand bias and discrimination, as well as a host of other things. When we talk about disability, we have to understand that nobody is exempt from experiencing it in our lives. We will all experience it at some point, whether it be ourselves or someone in our close circle. All right, I've vamped enough. I'm good. I brought it up. So this is the personal and the politics of disability. And this is by me, Imani Barbarin, as discussed. All right, cool. So this session will focus on how the perceptions and ideas that surround disability impact identity, interpersonal relationships, and how our historical outlook on politics both nationally and internationally. Like I said, when I think about disability, sorry, I see some confused faces, we're all good? All right, so when I think about disability, I think of this as the common denominator. So for considerations for what we're doing today, we're gonna practice some accessibility, we're gonna practice some inclusivity. So if you would like to speak, because we will be doing a Q&A after this, please raise your hand. When in discussion, as you begin relaying your thoughts, please say who you are so that people who are blind or low vision can know who's speaking at any given time. Please do not interrupt others, causing overlap or crosstalk. And if at any point you do not understand what is being said, you can raise your hand and ask me. I don't mind. I don't bite anymore. I'm not allowed to. So my question for everybody today is, what do you know about disability and its intersections? What are some of the ideas that you have around them. You could shout them out and I'll repeat them for accessibility. And how does it show up in your life? How do you think about that? How do you think about disability as it manifests in your life and the intersections you inhabit?
Is that for the audience?
Yeah, for all of you. Yes.
I have a child with vision impairment.
Okay.
He's 32 this year.
Okay.
And I've struggled with advocating for him through the school systems, careers, colleges, all of that. And what I feel is that we are still not there in terms of accommodating people with different abilities.
Of course, yes. Yes, sir. Excuse me, right here in the front. Thank you.
So, I'm the son of a mother who has Parkinson's. Over the past 4 years, who just recently had a major stroke and is learning to walk again, learning to speak again. And now I find myself as a son bathing my mom and brushing my mom's hair and trying to learn about Parkinson's. I've always been a person that's been concerned with, humanity and things that others have had. And now I'm seeing it firsthand, like, wow, like you really have to, I'm feeding my mom and I'm doing so many other things. And I'm not alone and my family, but it's, a community like this, and for our second year having this disability conference, and what you're going to talk about, because we research you, is really, therapeutically refreshing on multiple levels.
Oh, I love it. I love when we get to speak about these things out in the open and there's no barriers to our experience in relating to one another. Yes, over here. This is the last one, and then I'm going to move on to more slides.
I think about mental health, especially in the wake of COVID, and disparate access to treatment in communities and support within certain communities.
Yes, of course. Mental health with COVID and ongoing mental health issues with COVID, because it's not over, and there's a lot of people who have been impacted by both infection and the depression of being isolated. So what we're going to talk about is, I like for us all to get on the same page. Now, I know this is the definition of preaching to the choir, so bear with me. I know you all know this. So what is a disability? According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability which is defined by the ADA as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So what sticks out about this definition? I want you to pay attention to particularly the very last clause, and I want you to remember it. Okay, so the last clause of it is a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. I'm going to get back to why that's important, but I want you to lock it in. Glue it. Super glue it, gorilla glue it. Remember that? Never mind. So keep in mind as well that disability is also political and cultural through the lens of supremacy culture, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. It's not, thank you. It's not just an isolated or an individual thing where we see, hey, this person has trouble doing A, B, or C activity in their daily life. We're also thinking about the cultural impacts of disability and the way that disability is defined to also, how do I put this? To also oppress other cultures on the assumptions that surround disability. So in order to talk about disability, we also have to talk about ableism. So who here is familiar with ableism? Yeah. It kind of became that word for me when I was much younger in college and I was figuring things out that really helped me kind of set and direct the way I interacted with the world. Because I was born with my disability, I was born with cerebral palsy, but growing up, nobody really talked about disability discrimination in stark terms. It was just, oh, well, people will think of you this way because, this is going on with your legs. It wasn't very rooted in a definition that I could point to and say to myself, oh, this is what's going on. This is what I'm experiencing. So my brief definition of ableism is the interpersonal, institutional, and societal discrimination against disabled people. I like this definition as well by Talila Lewis, who is a disability advocate on Twitter. X, sorry. I'm never calling it that. Elon Musk could pay me $1 billion, I'm never doing it. So, their definition is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based off of societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place. Health, wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. I want you to lock that in, the last part. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And I want you to put it in contrast with that last clause of the definition of the ADA, right? Observed by others as having such an impairment. I want you to keep those two things together, okay? So what does ableism look like in action? What can we actually pinpoint? What are the moments, what are those little, what the heck's going on kind of moments where we can say, oh, that was ableism? So one of the very surface level ones is a lack of representation in the media. It has gotten better in recent years, but it's kind of ricocheting back. We're not seeing as many disabled or chronically ill characters on TV and film. There's also the idea of lifting requirements for jobs that don't require them, right? Why, if I'm putting data from one database to another, do I need to be able to lift 30 to 40 pounds? Is that because you need me to lift 30 to 40 pounds or because you don't want a disabled person applying to that job? Right? We have inaccessible transit and subway systems across the world. I lived in Paris for 2 years. There are 9 accessible stations in all of Paris out of 303. And they're hosting the Paralympics. We shall see. Some minimum wages in areas across the country is legal for disabled people to be paid below the minimum wage in many states still. Forced institutionalization. We have a history in this country, especially of sterilizing not just disabled people, but women of color, Puerto Rican women, black women, immigrants to this country, and we still do it at the southern border. Again, forced abortions or sterilizations. We do this on the basis of, well, you know, that disabled person can't take care of that child, or we can't possibly expect the system to meet the needs of somebody who shouldn't have a child in the first place, right? Anti-vaccination activism. I'm not talking about the people that genuinely, because of immune system disorders, cannot have a vaccine. I'm talking about the idea that disability is worse than death. That the idea of potentially being disabled in the infinitesimally small percentage of people who are, that is much better. That death is much better than experiencing that disability that comes with it. There are high rates of filicide, of the deaths of disabled children and caregivees in isolated incidents across the country that culminate in something we call the Disability Day of Mourning, which happens every spring. You know, in the 2016 election, I think it was AAPD that put out numbers that said 70% of polling places were inaccessible. The election, who we decide we want to represent us, that we want a voice in our society, and the places where we go to determine those things are inaccessible, is that a sign to disabled people that society does not see our voices as necessary for the communities that we wish to build? And then we also have disablement and debility as a tool of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Disability is used in the Congo, in Palestine, in Tigray, in West Papua to humiliate victims, to force them out of their countries, to make sure that they never return, because the system that they have where they are cannot accommodate them with their disabilities. And simultaneously, immigration and asylum systems are very difficult to navigate if you have a disability. So they're stuck in limbo eternally. So, disability is always political. And ableism has always been a tool in systems of oppression that manifest in interpersonal interactions. These things do not just happen in isolation. They are not just things we forgot to think about. They are systemic, and they, excuse me, and they impact people's daily lives, right? So how does disability impact the mostly marginalized, right? Every marginalization leads to disability in some way. I fundamentally believe this, that if you are marginalized, if you're oppressed in any way, disability will manifest more likely in the arenas in which you operate. So we see this in food deserts across the country that impact an individual's ability to access fresh food and vegetables. Black and brown neighborhoods situated next to pollutants or without clean water. To this day, red line neighborhoods have some of the highest rates of asthma, despite them not being officially redlined any longer. That is a ricochet that still occurs to this day. Negligence regarding climate change. The people most likely to feel the impacts of climate change are disabled people. When we see Hurricane Beryl ripping across the Caribbean and Texas and New Orleans, these are systems that will lead to not only lead to disablement, but lead to death of disabled people who cannot evacuate, who do not have the resources to evacuate. One of the things I always hear whenever I hear about emergency preparedness, I've already decided I can't go anywhere. I can't really run. But when it comes to emergency preparedness, they always say, have 30 days extra of your prescription. Who can afford that? How do you get that? If I get my prescription more than 4 days before my refill comes up, they won't let me have it. How are we getting that? How are we preparing? And these climate incidents are happening more and more frequently. That's terrifying, especially in light of COVID and the people newly disabled. How are they preparing? So as well, legislating that medical professionals do not have to treat queer individuals, right? We saw that a couple of years ago where certain states were saying, well, if your religious views impact your ability to do medical work, then you don't have to treat queer people. Legislating trans folks' ability to access gender-affirming care. In Tennessee, I believe it was, they put a stipulation that if you wanted to receive gender-affirming care as an adult, you know what you had to be screened for? Anybody? Autism. You had to be screened for autism. Now, why would that be the case? Well, we have to think about how we treat autistic people, right? We've created a system in which we strip disabled people of their rights. So if we attach marginalization to a disability, like a trans identity to autism, we can strip trans people of their rights too. And then the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which will not only disable people trying to seek abortion or abortion and reproductive care, but will lead to people, with psychological PTSD for the rest of their lives. Imagine going through one of the worst moments in your life and you simply are being ignored. And it's legislated that people ignore you. Not to mention that disabled people who want to seek an abortion probably will not be able to, right? One of the ways that they chipped away at Roe v. Wade was that in certain states, they said, oh, your abortion facility has to be ADA compliant. But then no facility that was ADA compliant would lease to them, right? It's not just that these things impact disabled people, is that the system of disability is being weaponized against others as well. And that has always been the case. But because we live in a society that kind of sees disability issues as, oh, they, them over there, we don't pay attention to it. For instance, the minimum wages, some of the best legislation put forth to raise the federal minimum wage. Remember, the federal minimum wage for everybody, which is what, $7.25? And has been that way for over a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, right? Some of the best legislation to outlaw that $7.25, to raise it to just not even cost of living, but just to raise it, also included a stipulation that if you wanted to raise the federal minimum wage, you had to do away with sub-minimum wage. Which, on the face of it, yes, let's do it, let's go. Absolutely. However, what happens to your disability benefits if you make too much money? Right? You lose your benefits. You can potentially lose your health care. You could lose the services that you rely on to live in your community every single day. And this was especially an issue for parents and family members of disabled people within the system. So the people that didn't want to raise the federal minimum wage went to the disability community, the family members, and said, you don't want this. Yeah, societally it's a good idea, but, you know, your child will be kicked off of benefits. So this is what I'm talking about when we talk about systemic oppression and the ways it manifests in our daily lives. This is it. None of these things are happening in isolation. They're interconnected like webs. So what are some of the numbers behind disability and other marginalized identities? Like I said before, if you are marginalized in any way, you have some of the highest rates of disability in your life. So, as it pertains to the disability and LGBTQ community, about 27% of the LGBTQ community has a disability, right? That's a high number. Globally, I want you to put this into comparison. Globally, the disability rate is about 15%. The United States has one of the highest rates of disability at 27% overall. But that means 2 in 5 transgender adults and 1 in 4 LGBT adults. That's massive. 40% of trans folks, remember what we said about how Tennessee put a stipulation in that they need to be tested for autism if they want a gender-affirming care? Right? Okay. Disability in communities of color. So 3 in 10 indigenous people in the US have a disability, 30%. 1 in 4 black people has a disability. 1 in 5 white people have a disability. 1 in 6 Native and Pacific Islander have a disability. 1 in 6 Hispanic, and 1 in 10 Asian people have a disability. I want you to think about the histories, particularly of black folks and indigenous folks in the Americas. What has been the massive crime perpetrated against these communities? We know. Now, putting that into perspective, does it then shock you that they have the 2 highest rates of disability in this country? Right? And these are self-reported numbers according to the census. What that means is, we may not know, it could be way higher, probably way higher. Because a lot of communities of color do not want to talk about disability. It is yet another marginalization that means that they are treated less than, that counts them out for work and for opportunities, keeping a roof over their heads. But we'll get into that as well. And then additionally, women in disability. So 1 in 4 women have a disability. You know that you're 6 times more likely? More likely. I always get in trouble with this on TikTok. But you're just 6 times more likely to be left by a partner if you're a woman that is diagnosed with an illness. 6 times more likely. The people who are most known for supporting communities, supporting households, are usually the first ones without support when it is needed. Not to mention that about, 75% of caregivers are women, right? So I want you to think back to that last clause in the definition of a disability. What was it? As observed by others as having a disability. And then also, the last part of Talila Lewis's definition of a disability. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. Let's put those things together and see what that actually looks like historically. Anyone could experience ableism regardless of a diagnosis. It doesn't matter. And some of the systems of power often use disability to medicalize features or actions of the marginalized. Drapetomania, runaway slave syndrome. They pathologized people who were escaping slavery and also institutionalized them. The same thing happened post the Vietnam War with anti-war protesters. They were also institutionalized, lobotomized, and experimented on under the basis that that was a mental illness, under the guise, more like, that it was a mental illness. Hysteria, you're just hysterical. No. Women were locked away. Women who had moxie, let's say. The women who were most outspoken, the most sexually liberated, were often locked away in institutions. They were also experimented on, lobotomized. And then we see a lot of queerness as a mental illness, which I talked about earlier. People have been chemically castrated, physically castrated. Again, institutionalized and locked away under the basis that who they are is an illness. And then because of this, it also makes these communities susceptible to the systemic ableism that disabled people are known to face. We create these barriers, we create these diagnoses in order to create barriers that keep them out of society. And then also, we can also become complicit in the oppression of the other to demonstrate the value of ourselves, putting other people down, making fun of intelligence, their capacity, keeping them away from certain conversations because we want to protect them. Does it feel like protection? I fundamentally believe that the way that we talk about disability can be seen in the way that we treat one another. None of this happens in a vacuum. None of this is just going to sit here in this presentation. You're going to go out into the world, and you're going to hear things in the way that we talk about one another. Oh, well, you don't want to vote for this you don't want to vote for this presidential candidate. You're stupid. For what? You don't like this policy. You're like the R word for disabled people. What does that have to do with anything? I don't like what I don't like. I'm basing things based off my experiences. What does that have to do with anything? We treat each other and we insult each other based off of the assumption that if they're unlike the way that we are, or that if they are unlike the way that we think, then they are somehow less than. And the easiest way to pinpoint how they are less than is to diagnose them with our words. And we do this every single day. We see it in politics. So don't get me started, it's just gonna make me upset. We see this in conflict in our homes. We see this as little kids even, making fun of one another. Although my brother kind of deserved it a little bit, if we're being honest with ourselves. My brother hid my crutches once, so that was a roundhouse kick. I was gonna lay down the punishment, if I was being honest. But there are other ways to voice our dissatisfaction with one another that have nothing to do with diagnosing somebody because it's convenient. We do this with a concept known as Orientalism and MENA people who are Middle Eastern and North African. We present them as barbaric, as not having the capacity, right? Capacity is a big word, to understand their actions. That's just how they are. They're just violent, barbaric. They're mentally ill. They don't know what they're doing. They're people, are they not? They're people. Move. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of how we talk about disability and why the communities especially who are most marginalized by this rhetoric, why we treat each other kind of like this. And it's because in our society, this is in the book Feminist Queer Crip by Alison Kafer. It's a really good read. It's a really good read. That book and then A Disability History of the United States is incredibly important. Love both of those books. But in her book, she says that disability is never seen by society as a permanent existence, but something to be overcome over time. Disability is not permitted to exist as a desired present or desirable future. So we can kind of lob those insults back and forth at us, knowing that the person will internalize them and try to work against them in any way possible. This is even more true for people who exist at multiple intersections and have been historically victims of state systems of violence because of it. And this has meant, too, that there's been a reluctance to identify with a disability and often hiding disability within themselves, their families, and communities. I'm sure that a lot of people in this room do outreach to different communities across the state, right? And I find that some of the hardest thing is to talk to marginalized communities about disability. And it's not because they're not knowledgeable. It's not because they don't theoretically want the service, right? But the idea that their need is attached to something so horrible, that's something that we in a society have talked down about since the beginning, right? And it's so hard. It's so hard to get people to say, well, this is the diagnosis. This is the service for that diagnosis. This is what you're entitled to. Because the barrier isn't just the system itself, it is what the system will do to them because of that disability. That's what people are afraid of. And then, wait, where'd you go? Am I going backwards? Yes. Okay. Wait, how? All right. All right. There's only one button, though. Look, I was so confused. Like, there's one button. How am I? Okay. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. All right. So because of this, we police our association with disability both in ourselves and in one another. Have you ever felt that before? Where somebody's like, you don't need to identify as that. It's okay. We don't need that. We don't want that for you. The big thing in my household before I just started ignoring my parents, which they're not happy about, but I am, was, oh, don't have a disabled mindset. When I started tweeting and talking about disability more openly on social media platforms, did you know my dad called me after every single tweet? Do you know how fast it is to send a tweet? I was doing like 15 of those a day. Imani, you need a job someday. And I can't pay your bills forever, so you're gonna have to not talk about disability because these people will not hire you if you talk about disability. Okay, Dad. Okay, bye. He would call me after every single one Because even though I was raised with a disability, I had a disability my whole life, the most discounting factor to my ability to provide for myself as an adult was going to be my disability. That's a conundrum. That's a little weird. But being disabled is often seen as an approach as a weakness or a deficiency that society needs to cast out by any means necessary. And therefore, marginalized folks are very careful not to be stereotyped as such. What does this look like in our daily lives? I'm a hustler. I'm a hustler regardless. I'm a hustler all day, all night. I don't care if I don't sleep for a week. I'm gonna get what's mine. I'm gonna get what I need. Your body's gonna break down, I'm sorry. Your mind is gonna break down. At some point, you have to stop and pause. We have an obsession with fit bodies. This is particularly true post-pandemic. So almost every single time that there's been a pandemic, there's been a rise in eugenicists speak and obsession with fitness. Ugh. I'm gonna make those gains at the gym. You do that. I'm gonna get fit, I'm gonna get swole. Okay. I don't know why you're telling me. I'm just here to get a coffee. Like, that's about it. You know, everybody wants to be very out and proud about how, you know, they're exercising, that they're built, they're worthy, right? They're worthy of your respect because they're taking care of their bodies, unlike those other people. I take care of my body, and it still looks like this. What does that have to do with anything? You know? Trying to overcome or outperform disability, right? You're so inspirational. Look at how far you've overcome. Oh, no. I'm not trying to outperform my disability. I live with it every single day. It's here every single day. Just because somebody else chooses that my disability no longer becomes a factor the more successful I am, does not mean it went away. I didn't overcome it, it's still right here. Thinking of rest as laziness. I'm gonna let that simmer, right? Particularly for women and women of color. You needing rest is not you being lazy. The world is not gonna stop because you laid down and took a nap. Scrolled on TikTok for a little while. That's just how I choose to do it. You know, nothing's gonna go wrong simply because you took your eye off the ball for an hour or two. And not only that, but your body is breaking very slowly. You may not recognize it right now, but the running, the going, it's gonna catch up with you eventually. And then what will you have left for your communities? The communities that you serve and love and need so badly. Then what happens? Not associating disabled people outside of a charitable or infantilizing dynamic. Oh, I just want to do so many good things for them. I just want to be so helpful and charitable to them. You are 30 seconds away from us. This is not this community over here, this community over here. This is a spectrum, and you're on it. This is the path you're on. And I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable for some people, but it's just true. It's just a factor of life. Disability is a part of humanity and just our human experience. Not including disabled folks in things. Now, I won't tell you about the rooms I wasn't let in, but I will say this much. They always forgot about themselves in a way. Disabled people have so much to offer to the table, our life experiences, what we go through, and we help one another. Most disabled communities, I'm not speaking for all disabled people because disabled people are people, but in every single instance I've seen the disability come together, it has been towards the betterment of all of us. And not including disabled folks and things doesn't leave us behind, it leaves you behind. But again, preaching to the choir, not you all, promise. And then also thinking harm simply befalls disabled people due to having a disability. right? This was especially true during the pandemic. People wanted to do away with protections for COVID because it was simply, well, those people are sick anyways. Oh, people with that disability already have a high rate of death anyways. We still choose life. We still want to live. It doesn't just happen to us. Everybody participates in harming disabled people. Okay. So in the fight for inclusion, ableism within marginalized communities, even out of a lack of knowledge, can have consequences. This ableism doesn't just stay there. It's not just like, hey, I don't like you. That's fine. But these are more systemic things that results in systemic violence. So again, like I said, advocating for abortion rights solely on the basis that somebody would want to abort a disabled fetus alienates disabled activists and advocates. For years, I don't know if you all know this, again, read Feminist Queer Crip, deeply important, but she talks about in there how whenever pro-choice advocates talked about disability, it was always through the lens of, well, you don't want that in your life. You don't want to have a disabled child. And then anti-choice activists were recruiting disabled people who were dissatisfied with that. You're not a mistake. You're not a burden. We want you in this world, but they think you are. So come to us. We're more welcoming, we're more forgiving of the things that they deem unworthy. They were very successful. And then those very disabled people went to speak at events and legislation sessions to take away abortion rights. You see how that kind of flowed into itself? Again, I'll just reiterate, in the fight for a higher minimum wage, people often forget disabled people are allowed to be paid below the minimum wage in most states. Again, this manifests in protests against a higher federal minimum wage on the basis that disabled people cannot maintain their benefits if they make too much money. Ain't that a trip, right? Oh, also, a little tidbit. The sub-minimum wage legislation also came post-slavery. That's important to note. As soon as Black people in the service industry were getting paid, they started tipped wages, which allowed for sub-minimum wages, right? You see how those things go together? Police violence in the prison industrial complex disproportionately impacts disabled folks. So about 40% of houseless people have a disability. With that legislation that was just passed down by the Supreme Court, that's going to be a death sentence to many disabled people, not being able to live on the street, not being able to have at least somewhere to rest their head at night. And this coupled with the statistic that about 30 to 50% of people who die in police interactions have a disability, right? This is a horrific culmination of systemic violence against houseless disabled people. Again, houseless people who are disproportionately disabled. Again, the national rate of disability in this country only sits at around 27%. And yet the people facing the most systemic oppression are overwhelmingly disabled. Okay, again, trans rights can be supported by the Americans with Disabilities Act, its protections, and advocates. Now, I won't go into the huge politics around trans identity, it's not my experience, but what I will say is that the ADA can provide some protections against trans folks, particularly those who have body dysphoria, mental illness due to not being in the right skin, as it were, right? So that's also an issue, and we don't really talk about these coalitions that we can build across networks to help one another out with disability policy. Because again, it impacts everybody. And then disabling people in conflict zones, knowing evacuation processes often do not include disabled people. Again, in an emergency, there's very rarely places where disabled people can go safely. When we are told to evacuate, there's not much opportunity to do so. When I moved into my apartment, I'm on the 8th floor of my apartment building, lovely views. But every so often, the fire alarm goes off Mostly because I think somebody's pulling it, if I'm being honest. It goes off too often for it to be necessary. It's the boy who cried wolf. But regardless, when I talked to my parents about getting out in an emergency, I was like, what if I can't? That's something that we have to think about every single day as disabled people. Post 9/11, I was living in New York City. I went to the Delta Middle School, PS 64, and it was a building without elevators, and it was 5 floors up. Now, why was I there? Because my mom wanted me there. She said, oh, it's the best school. I don't care, it doesn't have an elevator. She'll take time between classes. That was about it. But post 9/11, we had a fire drill. And I was panicking because I was like, I have to get out of this building, I have to get out of this building. But they didn't let me leave. In fact, they took me into a room, the designated fire retention room, right? The room where they keep disabled people who can't evacuate. And the entire time I was like, no, I can get out. I told them I can get out, I promise you I can get out. I could take the stairs. I know how to take the stairs. No, this is procedure. This is where you will be if there's an emergency. Somebody will come and get you. I don't want to wait for a world in which somebody will come and get me as a disabled person, right? I don't want to wait for the kindness or the memory of somebody else to make sure that I'm safe. Again, disabled people should be included at the beginning, from the start. If we're a part of your communities, we are part of your processes. And that should be the end of the story. See, I keep going backwards. It's one button. All right, let me see. All right, so that's forward. Now I'm going back. What is happening? Sorry. All right. Now it's to the end. What the? All right, I'm just going to speak. It's one button. I swear to you, I promise, it is one button. I'm having so much trouble. Okay. So I'm just going to speak towards the end. So what do the disability, queer liberation, and racial justice movements have in common? Okay, each recognizes the roles system plays in enacting state violence on marginalized communities. Each understands both the capacity for any individual to be a victim and a perpetrator of violence. We're not exempt. We're not exempt from being the people that are harming others. Even simply due to ignorance, sometimes we may not know that our actions have consequences to people, not just here, but across the world. Our cell phones, the gas we buy, the products we consume, all can have a role in harming somebody else, even if we don't know it. But we have to do our due diligence. Each desires to platform and take direction from the most marginalized in any community. We need to be listening to those who we think or who our perceptions tell us, excuse me, do not have the capacity to lead these movements. They do. Do away with your perception of what capacity means and can be. Each hopes for a liberated future in which community care and equity exist free of these systems of violence. We don't want to continue living in a world where we're harming each other and don't even know it. We don't want to continue to live in a world where these systems take advantage of other people. We don't want to be complicit in it either. And each understands the importance of cross-movement solidarity in achieving the end goal. We need to come together. The people in power are not going to be the leaders of the movements that get us free. Simply being represented racially, gender-wise, via our sexual orientation is not the end-all be-all. We actually have to be involved. We actually have to come together. And I'm not saying put aside differences, because I think the differences that we want to put aside can teach us something. But we have to actively choose to listen to each other. We have to actively decide that it is more important that I understand your experience than be in conflict with it. right? And I don't always have to agree. I don't always have to think you're right. I don't think a lot of people are right, to be honest. But I have to understand where they're coming from in order to navigate around the ways they see the world so that we can come together and collectively free ourselves. We are not free in this country. We are not free simply because we're able to consume what we consume when we want to do it. I envision a world in which disabled people don't have to worry that they're making too much money to survive. I want to live in a world where people have the reproductive health care that they need when they need it. I want to live in a world where food is free because people simply need it to survive. I know that's radical, and it doesn't look like I'm missing any meals, but I want to live in a world where it's free to the people that will need it. Why do we overproduce and then throw out food just to maintain the price? Why are there bins of slashed goods outside of malls that could be donated to people who need and want them? Why do we play these games with one another knowing full well that people can't survive as they are? And the goal is not to work ourselves into privilege so that we can just simply experience privilege, but we are to work ourselves and aspire to bring other people with us to make sure that nobody else is struggling. And I'll be honest with you, both of my parents gave me a really nice life. I was very lucky to live the way I lived and grow up the way I grew up. But I can't rest there. I can't sit there complacent knowing that I could potentially be harming somebody with my silence. I could be harming other people by not being in community with them. It is a choice all of us have. It is a choice all of us need to make and decide that we're going to take. That we are going to be there for one another. Because times are going to get hard. They're going to get much harder before they get better. And the people in power are not going to be there to help us. It's up to us, and only us. So let's talk a little bit about advocacy and how we can utilize some of the things that we've learned here today. I approach advocacy through the lens of communication because that's what my education is in. And also I like to talk a lot. So I was kicked out of a one-on-one piano class for talking too much. It was only me and the teacher. She was like, I'm done. Okay. So self-advocacy, advocate for yourselves. There may be a few self-advocates here. Hands up, who's a self-advocate? Woo! Yes. Okay. So, excuse me, it's cliche, but you cannot pour from an empty cup. And you cannot have a seat at the table if it's not accessible. You have to say what your needs are, and you need to give yourself space to rest. We can't keep running ourselves ragged. Running, a term I'm using liberally. But we cannot run ourselves ragged. In order to be effective, you need to practice self-care, and you need to speak up for your needs at every turn. Nobody's gonna put a seat at the table for you if you don't speak up and say it needs to be accessible. So we also have internal community advocacy. You need to provide, if you are in a community, if you're in a community space, you need to be providing accommodations for disabled people. This is for non-disabled people who may not know what is needed. Obviously, preaching to the choir. However, I need you to provide depth to your assumptions. Everybody has the capacity to lead. Everybody has the capacity to follow. Simply because we have perceptions around disability that say that this person cannot do A, B, or C does not mean that they're not a leader. And it does not mean that you do not have the capacity to follow them in their direction. And create initiatives dedicated to discussing disability and accessibility work in everything that you do. You are the liaison. You're the person to be like, well, hold on a second. How do we do this inclusively? And then if you are trying to bring disabled people into the fold that may not identify with a disability, make sure that you get them the resources first. It is less important that a person identify as having a disability than they get the resources they need to live their life with it. And I wholeheartedly believe that. Even though I'm somebody who's like, I'm disabled, rah, rah, shish, kamba, I know that that's not the case for everybody. And particularly for communities who are already marginalized, who are already experiencing harm, it's worse for me to see them struggle than it is for them not to identify in the same way that I do. I don't really care. But if you need housing, let's get you that housing. If you need accessible accommodations at work, let's get you there. That's more important than than us sharing an identity to me. And then also understand how cultural translation plays a role. This is like one of those like nitty-gritty communication concepts, but each culture has their own perception of disability. So it really requires that you listen to how they speak about disability, right? And then integrate that language in how you're speaking to them, because that will build that connection and get them the resources that much faster. Okay, and then also, if you do any sort of communication work or storytelling for advocacy, first you're gonna connect to people and tell the story through an individual lens. Then you're gonna broaden the subject to the community, to the community the individual story represents. So branch it out. It's not just an individual story. How does this impact more people? And then lastly, you're gonna give action items as how other people who are inspired by this, who are motivated to move based on the story you just told, how will they then do something about it? 1, 2, 3. All right. We're rounding up, I promise. So anybody interested in online disability advocacy? Okay, that's just me. We're cool. All right, so I'm gonna skip over that part. And then also make sure that everything is in plain language. This is another example of how being disability inclusive is good for everybody. The majority of Americans do not read above a 4th grade reading level. It's something like 54%, okay? So whenever you're dispersing information, ideas, concepts, make sure it is accessible through their language, through the language that you use, okay? And thank you all for your time. I know I sped run the last few minutes, but if you have any questions for me, or if I've gone over, have I? A little bit? We'll take like 2 questions. Does that work? Oh, yeah. Thank you. I told you I was kicked out of that piano class. I do talk a lot. So we have time for like 2 questions. Anybody want to raise their hand? No? Okay. Wait. All right. Well, thank you all. I thought I saw a hand back there, but, oh, over there. That kind. Over here. This gentleman right here. Yeah. Thank you for being the runner. That is not a job I would volunteer for.
Yeah. Hello?
Hello.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for that presentation. So I have a really general question. So in my role, I work in disability services at a university. As a person with a disability, I take that role in a unique way because I want to make sure that my personal, what do you call it, personal narrative doesn't impact my students, if that makes sense. Okay. But at the same time, I get to hear some of the harmful stories coming from my students. And they range, my students' ages range from 18 to 84, right? So I know it's a whole gambit of students that I work with. So my question is, how do we, folks who are doing student advocacy or disability advocacy, how do we make sure that these stories that we're hearing are being used in an appropriate way? First question. Second question, and how do we make sure that we can provide a space where they are not continuing to be harmed?
Sure. So I don't know, so you provide disability services. Do you have any groups on campus, like collective, like disability? You can nod or, you do? Okay. Excuse me. So what I think is really important as well is, like I said, providing that community space to have and relate those experiences to one another. And those individual experiences, I think, if they're open to it, those can be tools for advocacy, and advocacy with the administration and not just within your office. That's why I told the last part about like storytelling for advocacy, because those individual stories are not just individual experiences, they are emblematic of systemic harms that are manifesting in individual interactions, right? And so when those students tell those stories, that's the time to collect that data, right? How many of these students are having the exact same stories? Where are they happening? At what intersections are they happening? With which administrators or teachers are these things happening? Because that individual story is, like I said, is not just an individual thing. It is something that they're experiencing because of something systemic behind it. So if you can link it from that to that systemic issue, and then provide that information to the administration, to your colleagues, I think it will inspire real change. It will also give the students an outlet to make sure that their stories are going somewhere, that they're going toward the larger change that you want to see happen. Does that make sense? Cool. Another question?
Okay, we've got a question from one of our online attendees who's asking about advocating for themselves in the workplace. Their workplace is moving to a place that's less transit accessible, and they tried to speak out but got pushed aside and said there's so few people like you that your opinion doesn't matter. They're asking about your perspective on that.
Well, I suggest you cuss them out, but obviously, obviously that's not advisable. Realistically, though, one of the things I suggest to people in workplaces is to create a disability affinity group, right? If that person is brushing you off, saying that this is an isolated experience, and that nobody else is thinking about these things, I can guarantee you that it's not, and that people are just too afraid to speak up and say something about it. And so building, like I said, with this individual over here and this person in the chat, you have to build coalitions and community with people in every single space that you inhabit. And I think that the more people you can get on board with a group like that, the less isolated, I'm really upset now. The less isolated they'll think that this issue actually is. And to be quite frank, I don't think that just applies to disabled people in that situation. There are probably parents there that are caregivers to disabled children. There are probably people who are caretaking for their family members. There are people that may have invisible disabilities themselves that may not be able to commute in this way as well. So even if it's not necessarily a disability affinity group or like you frame it around disability, there are much more people. Like I said, disability impacts us all, so find the people for whom disability impacts, because there's a greater population than your employer thinks. Okay. I think that's it. So I want to thank all of you. Thank you for your time.